Hello, IP World History, and welcome to part two, the Cold War and hotspots that occurred during the Cold War. Of course, we have the nationalists and the communists in China that worked together during World War II to try to defeat Japan, and eventually Japan was defeated, and we recently looked at the atomic bombing of Japan and the surrender of Japan. So now Japan is out of China, and what happens is that a civil war now erupts between the communists and the Kuomintang. So you might recall that the Kuomintang was led at this time by Chiang Kai-shek. He had taken over after Sun Yat-sen passed away. And eventually what happened is that the communists did win this civil war. And when Chiang Kai-shek retreated, he and his followers went to the island of Taiwan, which is a rather large island, and with it they brought the nationalist forces and the treasury. They had a great deal of money that they brought with them, as well as the treasures from the Forbidden City. So if you can think back to the creation of the Forbidden City with the Ming Dynasty, followed by the Qing Dynasty, it was filled with treasures, with Ming vases, with furniture, with silks, etc. And they are now resting in Taiwan, and there is actually a museum in Taiwan that displays these treasures from the Forbidden City. And there are multiple treasures, so they trade out their displays every once in a while. Now, the relationship between Taiwan and China is technically considered an autonomous region of China. However, it has developed very much on a more Western capitalist model. So Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China in 1949, and this began a dramatic transformation of Chinese society into a communist mold. In other words, they lost the ability to have personal private property. The farms were collectivized, kitchens were collectivized. So in some of the rural communities where the agriculture was, people lived in very small, very simple huts, basically, and then they had a collective kitchen. And so they would eat collectively. They would all make their food together and eat collectively. Now, we're going to talk about China later on and some of the problems that occurred during the rule of Mao Zedong, in particular, something called the Cultural Revolution that was really devastating to the people of China. But at this time, 1949, the People's Republic of China is proclaimed, and it will be communist. Now, Korea is another hot spot for sure. So Korea is divided on the 38th parallel after World War II. This is a line of latitude that put North Korea, or the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, into Soviet control and a communist model. The Republic of Korea in the south will develop on a democratic model. Well, it wasn't long after the war before the North invades the South in 1950. So if you look at these solid red lines on this map, this is the North Korean invasion of South Korea. So the U.S. joins the war, and the troops are stationed in Japan. My dad was actually stationed in Sasebo, Japan, and from there they transported troops into Busan, which was basically the staging area for the U.S. troops to push back the North Korean troops. So if we look at the blue line here, we can see that through the U.S. invasion into South Korea, they actually move all the way up towards China. This is the Yellow River here. It's called Yalu River there on that map. So the Chinese enter the war on the side of North Korea, and they push back the U.S., and you can see the dotted red line here represents the Chinese invasion, of course, with the help of North Korean troops, and they actually go past the 38th parallel. They end up agreeing on the truce line right here in 1953, and this line remains to be called the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone. There is actually a building on the Demilitarized Zone that crosses the line from the south to the north. And ironically, there's something called DMZ chocolate that my niece got when she visited Korea and brought home to me. So who has DMZ chocolate? Me. Nevertheless, the war in Korea cost 3 million lives. This was a severe traumatic war for both soldiers and civilians alike, and there are many stories I'm sure that you can look up online. I will probably include one on our Schoology page, but this was a direct challenge to the idea of containment, and Truman was president at this time. The Truman Doctrine specifically stated that the U.S. would intervene when communist nations tried to challenge democracies that such as South Korea, and so the U.S. did get involved. They maintained this truce line at where you see on the map approximately the 38th parallel. No official treaty was signed that ended the war, and of course tensions continue between North Korea and South Korea. Families were divided here, guys. I mean, I know a person who was in South Korea and his grandparents were in North Korea, and they were not able to see each other at all until the end of his grandparents' life, and he was never able to see them again. So a very difficult war indeed. South Korea has had a tremendously successful economy, and North Korea remains a rogue state with a leadership that we're just not quite sure what they're up to. Another hot spot was Cuba. Now, I know that I have my pictures obstructing the map here, but there was intelligence to suggest that the Soviets were working in conjunction with Fidel Castro's communist government to build missile sites in Cuba. Now, let's step back a little bit. In 1959, there was a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. This revolution, and I actually, when I lived in South Florida, knew many people who had fled from Cuba into the Miami and South Florida area. And to this day, there is a Cuban area of Miami. It's a very uniquely Cuban district. They were very anti-communist, and they did not want Cuba to be communist. Nevertheless, the revolution was successful, and this left several people fleeing Cuba into the United States, especially into South Florida. Castro declares his loyalty to the USSR and to their foreign policy. And so in 1960, the US and the CIA worked together to send 1,500 Cuban refugees that are basically mostly in Florida. They go into an area, they land into an area called the Bay of Pigs. This was an epic failure. The U.S. is embarrassed. They are not able to defeat Castro's forces. And then we have the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, we see intelligence that shows that there are at least 5 missile bases in Cuba. Now, Cuba is only about 90 miles from the U.S., and these red circles here represent the extent to which they believed some of these nuclear missiles could reach if they were to be launched. So we enter a period of tremendous diplomatic action and threats between President Kennedy and Chairman Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR, and the standoff is highlighted. There are movies about it, and I believe that people in the USA were really truly concerned that the USSR, in conjunction with Cuba, would launch a nuclear attack on the United States. And then this, in turn, would launch a nuclear attack on Russia because the U.S. had missiles in Turkey as well as in Italy. So finally, through some very, very tense days of negotiations, and like I said, if this is something that interests you, there are movies about this tense standoff, but finally, they both agree to dismantle their missiles. The USSR dismantled their missiles in Cuba, and the USA dismantled their missiles in Turkey that were pointed at the USSR. Now, this is called brinksmanship, and we will see other examples of brinksmanship coming up in chapter 37. But this is the closest the world that the world comes to nuclear war during the Cold War. The next part we will look at is the arms race, and we will look at I will have you look at some videos of the tremendous firepower that was being developed during the Cold War. So thank you very much for your attention, and have a great day.